So yeah, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Elizabeth Cooke, who is a conservation advisor with Plantlife. Until September last year, when the project finished, she was the project manager for a 4-year project on arable wildlife called Colour in the Margins. And this was part of the Back from the Brink partnership. She's been a member of BSBI for 15 years and represents Plantlife on the BSBI England Committee and the Special Status Assessment Group. So today Elizabeth is going to talk to us about rare arable plants. So I'll hand over to Elizabeth.
I work for Plantlife on the conservation of arable plants, meadows, doing a lot of policy work on agri-environment at the moment. But today I wanted to talk to you about arable plants and a bit of where they come from, why they're special, and some of the things that Plantlife's been doing to help their conservation. So first, a bit of an introduction to arable plants. They're mainly annual species, but historically they would have been more perennial arable plants when ploughs weren't so deep and there was more fallow periods, but that's back in sort of medieval times. But in modern day, the annual communities are mainly seen as annual species, and they've got the same ecological niche requirements as the crop plant. So they're able to grow very rapidly from when the seeds germinate, and then they can fruit and set seed within a season. And the timing of the life cycles has to fit in with the crop life cycle. So sometimes the crops are sown in the autumn and then flower and set seed the following summer, and some crops are grown as spring cropping, so the plants need to germinate in the spring. And you have different arable plants cope better with these different management regimes. And some arable plants are really good at growing within the crop. They can cope with the shading, they can grow up tall. Things like corncockle and cornflower, they're typical, and poppies, things that you see within the crop, whereas other species that are, say, more low growing, a bit more light demanding, they tend to occur very much at the margins of the crop where there's a bit more space. So we've sort of some classic examples of arable plants. As I said, the poppies, cornflowers. You also get things like a weasel snout, this one lovely pink one here at the bottom. And as I was talking to Jim the other day, we were wondering where the name came from, and apparently it's the seed pods look the shape of a weasel snout. But I can't say I've spent very long looking at, and I've spent more time looking at the weasel snout than I have at an actual weasel to know whether it does indeed look like a weasel. So some species of arable plants are native to the UK, and they've sort of taken advantage of the disturbance that man provides to sort of move into the arable habitat. Whereas others have been accidentally brought in by humans, usually as a seed contaminant. And so they're very much part and parcel of farming, because as Neolithic farmers all the way to modern day have brought in new crops into the UK. As they've harvested the seed, they would have inadvertently harvested some of the weed seeds as well. And then these would have been brought across to the British Isles and then sown along with the crop. And so the relevant community with the crop, community of weeds, would have come along with the crop. And so things like corn buttercup and red hemp nettle are thought to have been brought in by farmers, and these are what are termed archaeophytes. So that's where they've been in the UK since at least 1500, probably a lot longer. I did a quick bit of number crunching from the Plant Act data, and as in the table below, to look at the proportions of species that fall into the broad habitat type of arable, and found that 22% of them were thought to be native, and a much bigger 44% were thought to be archaeophytes, and then more some neophytes that have been brought in after 1500s, and some more recent casuals. But although a large proportion of the arable flora is thought to be archaeophyte, I don't think that they're therefore to be deemed any lesser, because they're effectively native to arable land, in that arable land is an artificial construct of man, and that they are very much part of this farming system in the UK, and they've been in here in the UK as long as we've been farming. But then saying some of the species that are native that have taken advantage of the farming, you've got like cornspurry, and I found this growing on heathlands, say in the Brecks, or also you can find it on coastal sand dunes, and that's moved into the arable setting as well. So before man came along and chopped down the trees, you wonder, where did some of these, that 22% of native species, where did they occur? And there would have been lots of cases of areas where you would get natural disturbance that would have created the right conditions for arable plants. So we've got things like dried up riverbeds, dried up ponds, tide lines along coastal rivers and the sea, dunes, both coastal ones and inland dune systems like the Brecks. You can think of sort of fires coming through, creating woodland clearings, animals trampling through meadows, and actually it wouldn't have been meadows back then, grasslands. Anyway, there's a whole host of different types of disturbance that would have given the right conditions. And a picture top right is from a family holiday with my husband and daughters, and I do enjoy trying to find arable plants but in a native setting. So here on this cliff top, there was some Schradia arvensis, and then the picture at the bottom was from another coastal area. Again, more of the Schradia, and it's just really nice to see these species not growing in arable. That's yeah. So as well as all this archaeophyte flora, we've also got many neophytes that are coming in, and there's lots of species that are popping up and moving around, and sort of slightly older, sort of 1800s and early 1900s, the gallant soldiers came in, and they're spreading, and in some places quite frequent, whereas other places really rare. And then one to watch, I would say, in the present day is fiddleneck Amsinkia, which is very partial to sandy soils, and it's becoming a real problem in Suffolk, parts of Norfolk, bits of Yorkshire around me, and other areas of sandy land. And it is able to form a really dense sort of thicket, albeit a sort of 15-20 centimetre high thicket, but still. So I'd keep an eye out for that one. I know there are a couple of related species. The identification can be a little tricky, but it's yeah, and they're very difficult to control within a crop, because they like exactly the same things as all the sort of the more longer established arable plants, and so once it gets a hold, it can just smother out some of the other arable species. And interrupted brome is in here as a bit of a joke, in that it's the new species, in that it was extinct in the wild, but now due to conservation efforts, a lot of Fred Rumsey's done a lot for this species. It's now got a few established populations, including at Plantlife's Ranscombe Reserve, but it's needing a lot of help to maintain those populations at the moment. And interrupted brome used to be a seed contaminant of samfoin, which is a legume which used to be grown a lot for horse feed. So when there were lots more horses needed for everybody's carriages and working and ploughing fields, etc., there was a lot more samfoin grown. But nowadays we don't really see it at all. I've seen it in southern France. There's still grown as a crop there, but not so much in the UK. So communities of arable plants are they exist in the soil seed bank for most of the time, and what you see above the soil surface is just a snapshot of what's there in the greater community. And what comes up each year very much depends on what the environmental conditions were. So what the management was when the soil was disturbed, how wet it was, and the timing of that disturbance. And so they can be very flexible. So they're quite an exciting community because you don't know what you're going to get. From one year to the next, you can see a very different suite of species in the same place. So I say it's definitely worth going back to sites in multiple years just to see if anything's changed, if new things popped up. In order to maintain the most diverse community of arable plants, ideally you want a crop rotation which has lots of different crops in it that need different types of management, and therefore if you manage and do sort of spring cultivation followed by autumn cultivation, and you maintain a diverse community. But often nowadays that's not the case. You tend to just get winter wheat after winter wheat with very few break crops. At the bottom here we've got some illustrations of the Valerianella, the corn salads, which have most fantastic seeds. The picture here's got a lot of this broad fruited corn salad and narrow fruited corn salad, and you very rarely get them growing together, but when they do, it's a great opportunity to compare the seed sizes, because otherwise they're quite tricky. One's narrower and one's broader. So these communities of arable plants, they vary depending on the soil type. So you get certain plants associated with, these ones are on sandy and shale soils, things like corn marigold, the field woundwort, the Stachys arvensis, the weasel snout we were mentioning earlier on, and they all like the sandy soil, or you're moving on to sort of the clayer, heavier land, it's more impermeable. There's a whole different suite of species that can cope with these conditions. Corn buttercup here and spreading hedge parsley, two species we did a lot of work on in colouring the margins. And then on calcareous soil, some of the more sort of typical archetypal ones you would might think of, things like pheasant's eye, the Adonis annua, the red hemp nettle, the poppies, including prickly poppy and rough poppy, lots of fumitories, dwarf spurge. You can get the richest communities by number on calcareous soils. So I think one thing it's important to state is that arable plants, they used to be far more common than they are today. And they suffer from a phenomenon that's observed in many areas of conservation, of what's called the shifting baseline syndrome. And it's where you take as your sort of personal baseline for how things used to be, as from either the start of your career or from your childhood. And then you measure change, sort of present day change from that point. But the problem is, when you started your career, there was probably already massive declines happened before then. So this was first observed in the fishing industry, and people setting fishing stocking quotas were just remembering how many fish there used to be when they started out. So the same thing is very true for arable plants, and farmers, they often remember what it was like when in their childhood or possibly their fathers. But if you just take, say, corn cockle and cornflower, these species used to be everywhere. They were quite ubiquitous, but they were very common. And now they've virtually disappeared as native species. You find them in sown seed mixes, but as naturally occurring species, they're all but gone. And they've really suffered because they used to be seed contaminants, and they sort of grow up tall in the crop, and as the field is harvested, the seeds will be collected along with the crop, the grain, and then the farmer would save a portion of that grain to then resow next year. And as he did so, they would then re-sow some of the weed seeds and move about the weed seeds as they went. But nowadays there's technology to filter out seeds other than the sort of the grain of choice, and therefore they don't get re-sown again. So it's effectively wipe these two out. So this is one of that seed cleaning is one of the main reasons for arable plants decline. There's also the other things you would expect. Use of fertilizers and herbicides. Modern crop varieties are very vigorous, they tiller a lot, and they're able to really take advantage of the synthetic fertilizers that are applied, far more so than the arable plants. And also there's been quite a move from spring to autumn sowing cereals. So the species that like germinating in the spring, they've been really disadvantaged. And then in more modern times, we've seen crop rotations have simplified, and then they've moved to species like maize and oilseed rape, which don't usually support a good arable flora underneath them. The demise of root crops has been a real problem for arable plants, because often in sugar beet, turnips, etc., you would find a lot of, say, corn sperry and things would grow in and amongst it. There's far less mixed farming nowadays. People used to have to grow all their feed for their livestock on the farm, and so you would have small farms that did both arable and livestock. And so therefore lots of land that wasn't ideal for cultivation wasn't ideal for arable farming, but it would still have to be cultivated. And in these unideal for the crop was often ideal for the weeds. And in modern times now, we're facing the rise of minimum tillage and other conservation tillage techniques, which are really good for soil carbon, and far less carbon is expended when you don't have to go over the field so much with your large machinery. However, we're finding that it's really not very good for arable plants, and we're doing a bit of work on that at the moment with the RSPB. And yeah, and so just a sort of a stark example of this is from the picture top right, which is from Rothamsted, where I went on a BSBI visit, and it's the only site in the UK for corn cleavers, the Gallium tricornutum. And just the sort of the strip that the people are standing in doesn't get sprayed with herbicides, whereas the strip to the right does. And just over the many years of just that continuous management, it just has such a clear effect. So normally when I talk to people about arable plants, I have to explain about how important they are as part of the food webs, as pollinators, but I don't think I need to labour that point quite so much to the BSBI, because you will appreciate arable plants in their own right. But needless to say, they do form a good part of the useful sort of the base of food webs on arable farmland, and all the rest of the birds and the invertebrates require these species. So if you're wanting to go out surveying for arable land, the best places to look are where there are historical records. So if you can check on the DDB and find out where they used to go, it's where they used to grow, it's worth then having a look, see if anything's still there now. Finding sites where there's a long history of cultivation, often we find the sort of top of south-facing slopes where the soil's really thin, or areas around the edges of field, pylons, sort of the usual suspect. And this was just a little, obviously one of the difficulties with surveying for arable land is working out who the landowner is and getting permission. One technique I used to find this is on the DEFRA's Magic website. There's a layer for agri-environment schemes. There's little arrows on the left showing you which boxes to tick. And then within that, if a farm has got a countryside stewardship agreement and you click on the little I button at the top, you can then select some of these highlighted fields, and it will tell you who has that countryside stewardship agreement. So in this case, it's Brockdale Reserve near me. It's a Yorkshire Wildlife one, but you can then sort of copy that name and Google it, and often you'll find sort of a company's house register and an address. So that sometimes can be a good starting point to try and work out who owns and who farms what. But obviously it only works if they've got an agri-environment scheme agreement.
Just a few minutes left, Elizabeth, just to let you know.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. Okay. Thanks. So would advocate for arable plant surveying that going at the field level surveying is really useful. Because if you're giving management advice to farmers, they need to know which field something's in is better than knowing which monad it's in. And abundance data is really, really useful for looking at how populations change over time, and often going back multiple years, because the population sizes vary so much from year to year. And there's an arable plant surveying form on the Plantlife website if you're interested in that, and it gives a scoring system depending on species rarity. And then we find this data really, really useful to then create, say, maps like the top right, which we'd give to a farmer that highlight how many rare species there are in different fields and give them appropriate management advice. So yeah, sorry, we have to skip through some of these. So we say we've done a colour in the margins project, did a lot of work with farmers, really helping them to tweak their management techniques. Including we've done quite a few reintroductions, and we went through quite strict protocols working out where to do these reintroductions, and have done lots of record keeping and surveys to make sure that it was the right place to do it. We thought the seeds we got from Kew, and yeah, done a few reintroductions, including of this lovely pheasant's eye, which is really quite fantastic. And I will end there and say thank you very much, everybody, all the funders and partners, and all the photos. And if you want to find out more about the Colour in the Margins project, you go to the Nature Back from the Brink website to Colour in the Margins page, and there are a lot of resources both on the identification front and also about management and surveying and all sorts of different things. So please check it out.
Thank you so much for that talk, Elizabeth, and particularly for stepping in there 30 minutes ahead of schedule so calmly to deliver that. It was really fascinating with beautiful photographs, and I found such a contrast with the Arctic alpine plants I'm used to, but equally some similarities as well in terms of the need for disturbance and certain soil conditions. So that was really, really interesting. So I'm just going to have a look at some of the questions. Amanda Oliver asks, thank you for making a distinction between meadows and grasslands. Please, could you elaborate on this further?
So a meadow, technically speaking, is a grassland that is you would call it shut up between sort of March and July. That means that you don't allow any livestock onto it in the sort of spring period. So the grass then able to grow up, flower, set seed, and then it's usually then harvested as a hay crop at the end of the summer. And then the hay is then removed, and then you'd then have aftermath grazing of the arisings, which would then be in the sort of the autumn parts of the winter. And so that's a sort of a type of management that's been going on medieval periods onwards would be, so that's meadow, whereas grassland is anything with grass in. So we talk a lot about species rich grassland to try and sort of narrow that down a bit, but it's a difficult, the sort of general population thinks of meadow as quite a wide term, and a lot of cornfield flowers often get thought of as a meadow and get sown as meadow mixtures, when actually they're not. They're sort of cornfield annuals or something quite different.
Great. I've just noticed we've got Jim back here. Would you like to ask one of the questions to Elizabeth? I think we've maybe got a couple in the chat still.
Yes, I wonder if I could ask one of my own. The price of fertilizer is doubling currently, and it's very hard to get weed killers which are effective. Now, neonicotinoids are being banned by the EU. What effect do you think those two things are going to have on arable weeds in farmland?
It's very complex, the sort of farming, the different things that affect of sort of, we're expecting grain prices to go up, but whether they will go up enough to offset the cost of fertilizer. Because obviously if a farmer's going to get more for their grain they produce, they can afford to pay more on the fertilizer, but only up to a point. So I expect we might see slightly lower yields if they're going to put on fewer fertilizer applications. It might have a slight beneficial effect of making people really target where they put their fertilizer and when, to make the very best use of it, not just a sort of slapping it on. Not that farmers do, sorry, that's but yes, the neonic ban has had a massive effect on cropping, in that there's far less oilseed rape grown in the UK now, because farmers are really struggling to get it to grow because of the damage for flea beetle. And so then we end up importing more from, say, Australia that doesn't ban neonics. Yeah, there's a lot of complex, and it is hard to predict what's going to happen. But I think one of the issues with is that some of the farming unions have been very quick to jump on there's going to be a shortage of grain globally, therefore we need to plough up all these ecological focus areas, which just shows some of the sort of the dichotomy between the farming unions, who that's the quick thing they say. They don't say, oh, let's plough up golf courses and parks, but they're very happy to plough up, to suggest that we plough up all these bits that are set aside for conservation.
Can I ask a second quick question from Amy? She asks, is magic only for Britain, or does it work in Ireland as well?
Yeah, that is a very good point. Magic is generally, it's English data, but there are Scottish, Welsh and Irish equivalents. I'm not sure whether they have that same data layer available, the sort of the agri-environment. But yes, if you, I forget what they're called, but if you sort of search around for environmental data sets, Scotland or Ireland, or you should come across the right thing. I can search them out and put some in the chat if that would help.
Yeah, yes, please.
Okay, well, thanks so much again, Elizabeth, especially for delivering that 30 minutes ahead of schedule.